Okay. Yes, I'm on faculty at Loma Linda, but don't tell anybody after you've heard this presentation. So I have to start with a disclaimer that I am not a formally trained historian or a formally trained theologian or a formally trained sociologist. I'm a reckless amateur sociologist. I have a BA in physics at La Sierra, which they are reluctant to admit, and an MBA from UCLA. But I watch carefully. I'm a people watcher, and I make detailed observations. My boss insists that I start with a summary. Early Adventists were amateurs at theology, and the Review and Herald around 1850 was the primary form of communication to the scattered flock about theology, devotion, and church life. The letters to the editor and the obituaries reflect grassroots ideas often most clearly. And obituaries consistently showed us concern about salvation of the deceased, and they often affirm the deceased's goodness and character. We will meet them at the first resurrection. There's all kinds of words that we don't hear today. And obituaries reveal much about the community, its culture, and values. Now, I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Joseph Bates, because as he traveled talking to people after the Great Disappointment, he stopped at the general store in Camden, New York, in Oneida County, and asked to speak to the most honest man in town, and they sent him to Chandler Preston, who was a Millerite but not a Sabbath keeper. And Bates persuaded Chandler of the Sabbath, and he kept his daughter home from school back when school was Monday through Saturday. And she grew shortly. I think this is the fourth issue of the Youth Instructor. I stumbled upon a letter to the editor and by 16-year-old Janet Preston. The spelling of her name changed through the years. And what concerned me was what she wrote at the end of the letter. I mean to strive to keep all the commandments of God so that I may be accepted of him at his appearing and enter through the gates into the city and be in the presence of Jesus and the lovely angels. Now, this 16 years old wrote in 1852. So, and just unpacking the theology there is a 1-hour topic. She grew up, married Henry Satterley, a local farmer over in Oswego County, who was an Adventist. They're married in Roosevelt, New York. This is the only photo I have of them, very old. And I'm very lucky to go around the country and somebody else pays the airfare. But I found his grave marker, their grave marker, in uh, the little cemetery across the street from the Roosevelt Adventist Church. That's my rental car in the distance there. And just 30 feet to the south was the marker for Hiram Edson. Some of you may know that name. So they had 3 children, one of which was Henrietta. And this is my full uh, ancestry chart. And Henrietta was my great grandmother. I did meet her. She got an obituary in the Atlantic Union Gleaner when she died in 1966. And where I'm going here is the obituaries tell me a lot of things that never came down through oral history. And this is me standing next to her on the coast of Maine, just a little bit before she died. And she married James Kolb in Battle Creek. They had 2 children, one of which was Gladys Graham. She married Hans Peter Graham, my maternal grandfather, who was a minister in the Atlantic Union Conference his entire career. His last pastorate was at the Amesbury, Massachusetts church. He was assigned to 21 different congregations over his career, all over New England. And at one time during the Depression, he lived in Lyndonville, Vermont, and had uh, a bunch of companies. I don't know if the roads were paved back then, but that was quite a district that he had to cover. And anyway, he died in 1965 on the platform of the Washington, New Hampshire church. I'm trying to establish my Adventist credentials here. Now, they had three daughters, one of which was my mother, who married my father, Milton Scofield, after he came back from World War II. That's a whole story. And I am one of the two children of them. So I am a sixth generation Adventist. So I'm naturally going to be interested in my ancestry, starting with Nelson Satterley, who was an Adventist. He started out as a Seventh-day Baptist, and when he died, he left a wife and 12 children. Right there, I want to do more research. 12 children. And what was interesting, besides the 12 children, was that his obituary was written by J.N. Andrews 1 month before sailing for Europe. Now, elsewhere in my ancestry is Chandler Preston, and I only learned about 4 years ago that Ellen White had several visions in his living room, which explains why his daughter could get a letter published in the Youth Instructor. And we have his obituary in the Review and Herald in 1891. Another is Henry Satterley. Of course, you saw his picture with the beard, and his obituary appeared in the Review and Herald. Now, the Review and Herald was the only place you'd find obituaries until the Union papers started in 1901 or 1902. The purple folk in purple were all Adventists. There were a bunch that died before the Millerite movement, so we don't have obituaries for them. John Rawl was one of them, and he is my great grandfather. He was in the U.S. Army during the World War of 1812. He was a deserter. He was caught. He was tried in Montpelier, Vermont, sentenced to 6 months hard labor, escaped, was caught again, sentenced to 12 months hard labor. So I have deserter DNA. And it's a wonder that, of course, this wasn't known when La Sierra admitted me as a student. Noah Preston was not an Adventist, but I found his grave marker here in the Mexico Street Cemetery in Camden, New York, and he fought in the Revolutionary War. So, okay, there's a picture of me wearing white socks. For those of you who are curious, I donate blood every 56 days. It's good stuff, and if you are healthy and eligible, I encourage you to donate blood. I've also been very fortunate to be on the data management speaking circuit for the last 26 years, including 7 workshops in London and teaching workshops in Australia. Going back to Vermont, because Adventist roots are in not only the New England area, but the New England culture. And I was visiting a friend in Ludlow. Actually, she lives a little bit north of Ludlow. And on Sunday morning, we went to this little congregational church in Tyson. Tyson is basically an intersection here with the Echo Lake Inn. And we walked across this bridge, and I noticed the plaque on the bridge, and it was very interesting in its wording. It's the Stickney Bridge, memory of John Stickney, an esteemed and useful citizen. And I thought those were very interesting adjectives to use to describe someone. Well, eventually I found his grave marker. But this business of esteemed and useful citizen are characteristics that we see in a lot of obituaries. Highly regarded by the community. In one obituary, nearly 400 were at her funeral. It was until her death, she was an ornament to the church and a bright example to those around her, and lived a consistent Christian life. I'm drawing these from different obituaries. Greatly esteemed, there's that word again. Useful is another characteristic that we see. Losses felt deeply in the church where she was a valuable member. But the obituaries also have a third characteristic that they emphasize, and that is the goodness. For example, they kept the 10 Commandments, lived a consistent Christian life, tried to obey as far as he could the teachings of God's words. Now, um, this says to me that there was some uncertainty about the salvation of the deceased, and that is prevalent in early Adventist literature, this anxiety about salvation. Now, I don't, what we're seeing in the last 4 years with lockdown is the blossoming, I think, of Adventist historical research, and all these folk are doing wonderful stuff. Uh, and I'm not in their league, but I acknowledge their contributions to what we know about our history. So Adventist history includes the tangible history and the intangible. The tangible are the institutions and the conferences and schools, and the voted doctrine. That's an acknowledged part of history, and key persons. The tangible history is what you'll find in the SDA encyclopedia. Whereas the intangible history, which is a little more difficult to pin down, includes the culture, the norms of behavior, etiquette, standards, also the rituals. I guess that's in culture. The pop doctrines, and I've done a lot of speaking about the popular doctrines that were never voted. That's a 1-hour topic. And the anxieties and obsessions, the perceived threats. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And there are no easy metrics about those anxieties. No, there are no convenient metrics for historic anxiety. If you look at the emotions of past saints, their fears, hope, depression, anxiety, and if you inventory the influencers, the sermons, the church school experience, and the denominational periodicals, the evidence for their anxiety is in the unpublished personal letters, the letters to the editor, and the obituaries. I'm not sure that edited essays by ministers in the journals are going to reflect that anxiety so well. So when you look at the journals and reports that we have available on the SDA or the General Conference Archives website, we have a tremendous volume of material, about 1.4 million pages. And it's now more findable and accessible than it was 30 years ago. I can sit at home barefoot and read these journals, but there's so much of it that sampling is essential. So I do some sampling. I will create some charts based on my intuitive feel for what I have sampled. And what I am seeing is an evolution of beliefs, values, and norms of behavior, and tone and mood. There's an energy efficient aha. Uh, the big picture, to back up and look at the history of Adventist theology, which is based on scripture, both the raw text and the meaning. And I'm indebted to Bernard Taylor and John Jones for calling out the distinction between the raw text that we have and the meanings. Now, these have been formalized by the institutional church into a formal theology I call 27+1. And then there is a lot of creative emotive expression in the church. And there is also the popular theology, the unwritten, informal, and some of it rather bad. And then there's the midrash, the creative cerebral expression that we find in the journals and in the culture. And all of these are influenced to a certain extent by the world outside of Adventism: culture, technology, economics, the political world, and the ideas. Focus on the midrash, and that's a Jewish term, but it sure works to describe the Adventist material. It is influenced by the writings of Ellen White, by proof text theology, official voted doctrine, and this creative emotive expression. And that midrash includes what students in academy heard in their Bible class, not necessarily from textbooks. So again, if you look at the volume of expression available to us after the Bible and the writings of Ellen White, we have a lot of stuff that is what I'll call Adventist midrash. Now, the membership is exposed through all these media, and the basic themes that I'm seeing in the midrash is either the good news that God loves you, that salvation is secure, or the bad news that salvation is precarious, all the threats that we worried about, particularly in from the 1890s to the 1950s, and the volume, and I use the width of the arrow to imply the relative volume of these messages going to the Adventist members. It's mostly bad news, and it's reinforced within the membership by word of mouth. And before there was social media, there was word of mouth. Now, part of the midrash is graphic or illustrations that show or imply a theological notion. Here is one of the judgment, where the sinner is standing alone. Notice Christ appears to be the judge. There's bleachers full of angels, and that is one picture of the investigative judgment, whereas another picture shows the sinner standing very humbly, and the visual elements here include the 10 Commandments at the back, Christ pleading for us, and the shadow of Christ's figure is a cross. And I can't see the fifth thing, but you can. So what we have in the history of Adventism is ambiguous theology. And this is just an example: standing without a mediator or standing with a mediator. And these images often leave a more lasting impression, especially upon young people, than any didactic written discussion. This image appeared in the Youth Instructor in 1944, a very effective artist showing the second coming. But look at the face of this sinner who is afraid of the second coming. So fear of the second coming, fear of eternal loss, has prevailed in the history of Adventism. The message here: second coming is something to be dreaded. Now, if we look at the timeline of Adventism, William Miller lived and influenced and preached until about 1848. There was one journal that's on the database, the Midnight Cry, that was published before the Great Disappointment. But the Great Disappointment in October 1844, shortly after that, James White was in Middletown, Connecticut, when he published Present Truth, and that evolved into the Review and Herald, published from Paris, Maine, and then to Saratoga Springs, and then Rochester. And then he also started the Youth Instructor. And I find it interesting that the organization of the General Conference occurred in the middle of the American Civil War. One thing that changed, and that's a whole other topic, is the Signs of the Times that was printed out in California in 1874. And it had a totally different style and tone compared to the Review and Herald. Now, So we have the Youth Instructor, followed by Insight Magazine, the Signs of the Times, and then when in 1901, after there was a reorganization of the GC and they inserted the union conference level, each of the union conferences um, got their own journal. And so in California, we got the Pacific Union Recorder. And those journals started printing obituaries, and the Signs of the Times and the and the Review started backing off from printing obituaries. The context in the American market included Scientific American. Actually, the Review and Herald reprinted some stuff from Scientific American. The Saturday Evening Post, the National Geographic, Newsweek, and Time, and the media market, and thus the competition for eyeballs of Adventist members changed with AM radio broadcast and then television. Okay, the golden age of Adventist journals with little competition was between 1890 and 1925 or so, and there was a high ink to member ratio, and I'll expand on that in a little bit. So you have all these denominational journals with a tremendous amount of content, actually a big amount of space to fill, and just my intuitive plotting of anxiety in the North American Adventist Church. That's the only part of the church I can talk about. It started to fade after World War II, actually in after 1990, and we can unpack that sometime. We don't know what the exact numbers are on that. That's an hour discussion right there. If we look at the first issue of the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, the article titles are very interesting. When was the Sabbath instituted? I think you can read faster than I can talk, but it's basically about the Sabbath. What day is the correct Sabbath, and the authority and issues around that change. Now, in fact, if you look at the first 12 issues of the Review and Herald, and I tallied the topics of the articles, the obsession is with the Seventh-day Sabbath. After that, the sanctuary. So that topic was emerging. The law of God and the commandments were very important. So that was the emphasis in the first 12 issues. If you look at some of the issues in 1862 during the Civil War, the Sabbath still ranked highest. There was a series on Christian history and one on spiritual gifts, but the Sabbath still was the most important and distinguishing doctrine, obviously. The layout and graphic style, very small print, no white space, no ornamentation. The whole tone was frugal and a great sense of urgency about warning the world of the second coming. Now, this was the style in other journals too: small print, narrow margins, except for the Harper's Weekly, which was published during the Civil War, and it used illustrations, but they had the resources to do artists and illustrative that the church journals didn't get until much later. If I did a survey or categorize the distinctive elements in the Adventist Review, a tremendous variety of content, and that one could create a taxonomy of this stuff, but it is fascinating to look at. But particularly of interest are, to me, were the letters and the obituaries. The tone of the early review was urgent and strident. There was emphasis on legalism and demands of the law of God. There was vigorous debates about theology, a fear of eternal loss, but there was also extraordinary candor and transparency about the business of the church. We knew who donated how much. That was printed. We knew how much was reimbursed to James and Ellen for a trip to some place. Again, the major theological points were the second coming, the judgment, the seventh-day Sabbath, proper Sabbath keeping, and later came along temperance and healthy living and modesty, and eventually the purity of the flock. The authorities outside of the minds of the authors were, of course, Scripture, the writings of Ellen White, and all of it assumed verbal inerrancy. Now, if you go to the bottom of the first issues of the Review and Herald, you have this section where they list all the letters they received, or the authors, not necessarily the contents. And here is a letter from Hiram Edson, and here is a $1 donation from my great-great-great-grandfather, Chandler Preston. So he was in the middle of it. Now, I have a concern, and this is one of the reasons that I kind of plunged into this. I have a concern about institutional memory of the people who took Adventism very seriously, particularly the ministers, the donors, the teachers, the workers, the colporteurs, authors, and institutional workers. Do we remember and honor their sacrifice? And to a lesser extent, the students. What happened to them? Did they stay in the church? I don't know why I'm so curious about this. Are they remembered? Is there an obituary for them? And what did the obituary say about them? For many names that I find in the 1910s of the Gleaners and the Southern Tidings, there are workers for whom the index has no obituary. I wonder about that. What about their children? Are the metrics doable, and are metrics important about these phenomenon of early Adventism? So, and there are complications. 30 years ago, I was tempted to get involved in my own family ancestry, but I thought I'll just wait. Eventually, it'll all be on the web. Sure enough, it's all on ancestry.com document database, a very rich resource. But maybe in 5 years, we'll have software that'll read all 1.5 million pages and extract all kinds of metrics for us. I don't know if that's possible. We'd have to teach it our desired taxonomy. So there are complications in the metrics, the total growth of the church, the migration of people from place to place, and of course, name changes. Printing early on was very labor intensive, which amazes me that they typeset the names of all the people that wrote letters to the editors. Now, if we look at the geographic characteristics of Adventist history, it first grew up in New England, particularly Portland, Maine, and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The second centroid of Adventism centered around Rochester, New York, where the Review and Herald was published for quite a while. And eventually it moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, and the centroid kind of moved west, partially enabled by the spread of the railroads. So if I just do a sampling of the obituaries and the geography of the scattered flock, it's a band extending from New England across to Iowa and Minnesota. Nobody in the deep South that I could find. And that's to be expected, because if you look at the birthplace of some of the major movers and shakers in early Adventism, it was all over New England and upper New York State. So so Adventism in its infancy was a rural faith. It was a rural movement, mainly on farms. And so you got to wonder what what sources of information did they have out on the farm, and so the denominational journals would have a major influence, and that's why they're so important. Well, obituaries are generally authored by either the minister officiating or the family member, and they reveal grassroots theology, values, and fears, and the values of individual members. So this isn't official doctrine coming down from some meeting in Minnesota. This is the grassroots. And they are metrics of community. And community is changing so much in modern Adventism. There's a decline in frequency and length of obituaries published in the Union journals now. The structural elements are decreasing, the number of structural elements, and many loyal workers are missing from our collective institutional memory. I took, just for example, from the Andrews University Library index of obituaries, I counted the number of people with the name of Smith. And up until 1950, it reflects the growth, numeric growth of the Adventist Church. But things started to fall apart after 1970, and the Union papers published fewer obituaries relative to the number of members, and of course, there's also a demographic shift here. Smith is obviously an Anglo name. So let's look at some of the obituaries. This is the first one that I could find in the Review and Herald, December 1852. And what is interesting is at the end of the obituary, there is verse, some kind of poetry. And let me I'm still I need to poll my friends in who are English teachers. Poetry took a lot of space in early Adventist journals, and I wonder if anyone has done research on that. First of all, how much was it composed within the Adventist community? How much of it was repeated? There's all kinds of questions I have about that, but that's out of scope. She had nearly prepared breakfast when probably an artery burst, and in a moment life was extinct. Here the brethren from several of the communities in northern Vermont attended her funeral. So there is a measure of esteem and value. Here's one in the Signs of the Times, which was kind of a West Coast version of the Review for a few years. His sufferings were borne without a murmur, and he found much comfort in a season of prayer that were held for him. His last days were of communion with heaven and his heart, and seemed to overflow with praise for God. He felt at perfect peace with God. Another one here, a toddler, age 2 years, 6 months. Also on the same day, sister, age 6 months. They were interred in one coffin. So what we also see in the early obituaries is a high death rate of children and infants. In 1875, the disease was ovarium dropsy, pronounced incurable by physicians. Although she suffered extremely, she passed away praising God and rejoicing in a blessed hope and immortality when the Lord shall come. Nearly 400 were present at her funeral. Sister Osborne lived a consistent Christian life, having been a member of the church for about 6 years. She was a kind and affectionate wife and mother, and leaves a husband and 8 children. Now, obituaries always are kind to the deceased, so we shouldn't be surprised at these laudatory expressions. Leaving a husband with 8 children. What I guess is he probably remarried very quickly. But if we look at the average number of children in the United States historically, back in 1800, the average was 7 children per family, Now it's down to 1.73 children per family. In 1900, it came down. This is partially a result of urbanization. It was partially a result of better health care. If you got to remember, most of early Adventism were farm people, and you needed more children to work the farm. This one's interesting. Before prayer, she wanted to say that she had not kept the Sabbath so well as she should, and in some other timings she had done wrong, and earnestly requested to us to pray that the Lord would forgive her. So she's struggling for forgiveness. After our first session of prayer, she called her oldest daughter, about 14 years old, and a younger son, and earnestly pleaded with them to serve the Lord and promised to her that they would keep his Sabbath. So Sabbath keeping appeared to some people to be a condition of salvation. The trend I'm trying to show are both the praising of Stoicism. His sufferings were great, but he bore them with Christian fortitude. And the anxiety about salvation. This is thirsty work, and there are no bars in Loma Linda. Her illness was lingering and painful, but she bore it with Christian fortitude. Did I just read that? We believe that he will have a part in the first resurrection. These are two different obits. She was converted in 1870 and ever lived a consistent Christian life. And here, and in many of these obits, the author included a poem at the end. Here's one from Ottawa County, Michigan. Aged 5 years. So the children were very vulnerable to disease. This was a little girl. It was very consoling to the bereaved and sorrowing parents to remember how obedient their little daughter had been and the deep interest she had manifest to be in her class in the Sabbath school, and how she loved to talk of heavenly things, and how she would love to go to be with the angels of God. And in this town in eastern Michigan, what do we have here? Ma, I shall come up in the morning of the resurrection. They will not forget me. 5 years old. Well, the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, just in one issue, we saw a variety of diseases, and so some public health graduate student, with the help of maybe Chat GPT, can create a lot of data or summary data about what was killing off the saints. But just sampling a few of 157 obituaries during the Civil War and thereafter, the primary cause of death was consumption, diphtheria, typhoid fever, lung fever, things like that. Here are two daughters in the same family, died the same day of the same disease. Very tragic. Two sons dying of scarlet fever, a most painful illness. This was in 1864. And this is 160 years ago, they were saying, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus." Two boys, both 1 year, 11 months, and dying and obituaries in the same portion of the Review and Herald. So I did a tally of the age at death of the saints, again in 1860s, and by far the highest group or decile were those 0 to 9 years of age. But this is not to be surprised. This shouldn't surprise us, because the child mortality rate in 1800 was 463 per thousand. There was a spike in the cholera epidemic and one during the Spanish flu. Now it's down to 7 per thousand. This is, again, the United States. This one was interesting. While they mourn for their dear children, and their hearts are comforted by the thought that they are taken from the evil to come. So what is that evil to come? And I suspect that was a fear of last day events, last day persecution, and how difficult they anticipated it would be. Um, Here's another one. Fearful that he would not be able to endure the intense suffering with the Christian patience and fortitude that he ought, but the Lord sustained him. So that is another theme I see in the early journals. He bore his extreme suffering with great Christian patience. Never, you get the picture. Okay. Oh, he. This was one element of some obituaries, was naming who baptized them. In this case, Brother Joseph Bates. This one was marginal. We tried to labor with him faithfully for his salvation, and we think he sleeps in hope. Lord, be merciful to me, and and take me from these sufferings. I am dying. Meet me in heaven. Um, Young man gave his heart to the Lord a few weeks before death and left good evidence that he would have a part in the first resurrection. Okay. Oh, this was interesting. Published in the review, but a message to the Signs of the Times, please republish this. I haven't seen that yet. So I'm going to skip this. At the Again, just counting the places where they died, mostly Michigan, New York, Vermont, Iowa, Minnesota, Ohio, and parts of New England. And again, the scattered flock was spread across there. Now I'm looking at the clock, and I'm going to just show you what this is from a separate talk I do on Adventism under the Blitz in the British Union.
Michael,
Yo,
Michael, this is Lauren. Just to keep talking, everybody is totally fascinated by this, so
okay,
don't cut it short on our behalf.
okay. Thank you. Um, I surveyed the obituaries in Britain during the Blitz, and they all had these 10 or 11 structural elements. What congregation they were in, the location of death, the age, their conversion experience, a narrative of that, how they became an Adventist, a summary of their career, often a named minister influential in their accepting the truth, as well as the name of the minister who baptized them, a description of their final days in suffering, and there's where that stoicism comes in. The description of the service, who was present, a description of survivors, and especially if they are in the work, and at the end, a proclamation of the blessed hope. Time after time in obituaries in the British Journal, we saw this. Uh, Kind of historic interest. A few of the Adventists died in bombing incidents. The flying bomb, I think, was the V1. And this was fun. Born of sound Protestant stock in a district where Romanism predominated. So we're buoying the image of the deceased. This was someone from Northern Ireland. The Atlantic Union Gleaner, starting in 1902, the Gleaners, the Recorders, the Tidings, they took over a lot of the obituaries, as the Review apologized for not publishing all the obituaries that they received. And so the obituaries generally in the Union papers were longer. Here she is, an esteemed member of the Everett Church. That's just outside of Boston. The Lake Union Herald, 1908. Here is The death resulted from a fracture of both tables of the skull caused by being kicked by a horse. There are some interesting causes of death. One fell out a third-story window. But look at there is poetry written very specifically for this death. That's interesting. Now, the Union papers, and this is a whole other topic, but the Union papers also had so much space to fill that they wrote lengthy descriptions of the weddings, and I have descriptions of my grandparents' weddings, uh, and a lot of detail about the individual members. For example, Ruth Jones spent a pleasant weekend in Springfield with her sister-in-law. That kind of detail made it into the journal. That's a whole other topic. So a little bit more about the American Civil War, 1860 through 1865. I only found 2 obituaries of Adventists. Now, the Civil War was not drafting people at the first, and the draft process was terribly corrupt. Only about 50,000, and I'm talking about the Union Army, were drafted against their will. A total of 2.2 million served in the Union Army. The draft laws were very unpopular, both in North and South. 120,000 Union men had evaded the draft, many to Canada, including John Muir evaded. I learned this when I went to his home there in Northern California. 280,000 soldiers deserted, 100,000 Confederate soldiers. There were a few women that enlisted. So if we look at the deaths of Union soldiers, twice as many died from disease as died in combat. Now, here I could insert the story of one of my great-grandfathers who was wounded in the First Battle of Bull Run, hospitalized, discharged, and went on to father 8 children. I'm proud of him. Then in the Battle of Chickamauga, an Adventist soldier from, where did he come from? I think he came from Iowa. While he was a soldier, he did not join in the sinful amusements of his comrades, but tried to obey as far as he could the teachings of God's word, which he spent most of his leisure time reading. So here is one Adventist killed in battle. If you plot the number of deaths per month in major battles, things slowed down during the winter and then they picked up in the spring and summer. I don't know if that's relevant to Adventism, but the other obituary, and this was published several months after he died. He was captured at a Battle of Bean Station, Virginia, in August 1864, was confined to a Confederate prison where he underwent all the ill treatment of a prisoner at the hands of the rebels. Now, right there's a little bit of pejorative bias. He died of starvation January 27, 1865. He was a good and brave soldier during his stay. So I'll kind of summarize here. What I see are 2 contradictory doctrines and tone in early Adventism, and this is found in so much other material that I haven't covered. First of all, salvation is difficult for us to achieve, or salvation is a free gift. Correct belief and behavior is essential for salvation, or incorrect behavior is potentially harmful, but God doesn't want suffering. So don't worry about sin, but still be good to people. God would rather not save us, but Christ pleads on our behalf. That's what I grew up with in Academy Bible. Rather, God is on our side. He wants us to be happy. One unconfessed sin will negate your salvation. And there are a lot of Adventists that believe that. Don't worry about salvation. It's a done deal. There's plenty else to worry about. So this is salvation by works and salvation by grace. These two very contradictory doctrines coexist in modern Adventism today. So I'll no, I'll take one other, if I can find the link. I need to move my. Oh, I don't see the link. Okay. Um, let me go back here. There's the link. I'm trying to. Oh, to fulfill the description, I want to briefly survey the sources of anxiety in early Adventism. And this is really 2 hours of material, but and by the way, there are other derivative metrics for behavior. The obits per 100,000 members, right here. This is an indication of a decline or a very profound change in community, and the baptism rate in North America is declining. There are many changes in the church that are so gradual you wouldn't notice them unless you charted them as a metric. Okay, so discrete events can yield useful aggregate metrics. What else is missing? I'd like to see someone do an economic and financial history of institutional Adventism. What workers earned, the differences across jobs, the employee benefits. When did health coverage start for Adventists? Financial ratios for institutions and how they changed over time. When did conferences and institutions uh, assume risk and solvency? Budget and spending, where the tithe and offering went and how that changed over time. But anyway, the main sources of anxiety in modern Adventist history were Catholicism, the separation of church and state, temperance and prohibition, the Sunday laws, the calendar reform, labor movement, unified world government, persecution, and the precariousness of salvation. And it's very easy to devote 10 to 20 minutes to each of these. And you have to understand the North American Adventism existed in a context of industrialization, child labor, the Civil War, the urbanization, as I said before, massive immigration of many of Catholics, and evolution in transport that enabled the itinerant ministers to move more freely, and the enhancement of literacy. And literacy is a very important skill for the Adventist faith. So just briefly, the threat of Catholicism was very, very commonly talked about in the journals. I'm not going to read all of this. Roman Catholicism, with its worldwide ramifications and its dogmatic beliefs and claims, appear to be such a force. The separation of church and state in the around 1910 through 1920, the Review and Herald ran a lot of what we would describe as cartoons or political cartoons or illustrations to emphasize that anxiety. This one is the forces undermining the American Republic and the freedoms that we have. So there are all the evil forces undermining our freedom.
Excuse me, Michael, do you have slides on what you're saying now? Because we're not seeing any other slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's okay.
No, what I forget, I did a hyperlink, and thank you for reminding me. I did a hyperlink, and the Zoom didn't follow the hyperlink.
Got it. All right.
Lesson to future. So I'm going to exit that, and I think I'm pretty much done. And we're at 31 minutes after the hour. I think I think you got the flavor of what my concerns are, and we can open it up for discussion.
All right. I didn't mean to cut you short here, Michael.
No,
but
I had enough to go another half hour. I always pack more. I packed the more trivial stuff towards the end of the slide deck.
Well, this has been really, really fascinating. Wow. You have unloaded on us a lot of information, a lot of which I was not aware of, and perhaps many or most of us. And I have a series of questions. I'm sure others have. I'm going to ask the group here to begin raising your hand. I see 3 hands already, and I will call upon them. And I'm kind of intrigued in some way, and maybe not surprised that some of the contradictory doctrines and tones about salvation by grace or by works have not been resolved. We still have both of those camps holding on very tightly, and it would seem that in 150 years we should have found a way to sort it out, right? But here we are.
I'm a denominational employee, so I will temper my comments on that.
I hear you. I hear you. All right. Brian Strayer, please unmute and ask your question, make your comment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Scofield. I was truly fascinated by what you just presented, and I'll tell you why. About 3 years ago, I was asked to give a historical overview of the Indiana Conference for their 150th, their sesquicentennial. And I did much the same as what you did. I didn't think anybody would be interested in it, but I did also include the obituaries, and what I gathered from the obituaries is pretty much what you have just presented. The Indiana Conference president and secretary told me that there would be a link on the Indiana Conference website if you cared to go there and just check on that and read what I had to say. I covered the obituaries from 1850 down to 1900, so the first 50 years. But there is a history of the Indiana Conference that covers the whole history up to the present. But thank you so much for what you presented. I've been particularly interested in it because I've done the kind of detailed work that you have just presented. Thank you.
Yeah. It's challenging giving a fair picture of the history of Adventism. Last year, I was invited to do a series of lectures for a La Sierra religion class, but it was specifically for non-Adventist students. And that's an interesting challenge. Yeah. And being both non-judgmental, but also non-apologetic, and just describe what happened. And that was a very fun experience, and I hope I get a chance to do it again.
Good.
Thank you. Gerald, I believe you're next. Gerald,
okay. Thank you. Michael, interesting, and I'm really appreciative you brought up in connection with these beliefs, the attention to education that Adventism espouses. Perhaps this is a little anecdotal, but I think it's illustrative. Today, our pastor preached a sermon in which he emphasized the distinction between fear and fear, meaning fear versus awe. It's amazing to me how educated people can't understand two diametrically opposed emotional responses that use the same word. And yet I think it's the default mechanism in my childhood, certainly, and I think still in many people in my church after the end of the sermon, was that fear meant you better be pretty afraid of this guy because, you know, it could torch you.
Yeah, we trip over homonyms all the time.
And there's probably a lot more, but I mean, that one
Yeah.
to me is core and makes such a difference about the perception of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel, for that observation. Lauren, you're next.
Michael, this was just amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and feel very, very educated by what I've read. I've been doing a lot of work on from a pastor's point of view, on the fearful part of Adventism. I grew up with, very fearful sort of Seventh-day Adventism, and whenever I write something about that, there are people who will jump in and say, "No, Adventism isn't fearful. It's just the words are well, it's hopeful for the second coming, and the parts that you think are fearful are just realistic. We're just telling the truth about what's going to happen to you." And so, yeah, that your presentation helps me to realize that I'm not wrong when I say that the DNA for fear is very deeply rooted. It goes way back to the beginning of Seventh-day Adventists. We were fearful people from the very beginning. And you said, you gave this contrast at the end, and I took a screenshot of that just so I could remember it. The contrast, the way works and fear were contrasted to righteousness by faith. And it is, you really hit that hard. You're absolutely right. We talk out of both sides of our mouth on that, and they're absolutely contrasting ideas. We say, be very afraid. And at the same time, we say, yes, we're saved by grace in Christ alone. I remember coming home from Walla Walla College, very excited because I had taken a class from Malcolm Maxwell. You remember Malcolm?
Yep.
Graham's youngest brother. And he had explained to us straight out of Galatians what it means to be saved by grace. And I told this to my pastor, and he said, "Oh, Lord, they're teaching you error. They're teaching you error there." He said, "You have to be very afraid." And I said, "Well, what does that stuff about saved by grace mean?" He says, that's only describing sort of the technical aspects of what goes on behind the scenes in God's part. As far as you're concerned, you still have to live up to absolute perfection. This is only where it's like the difference between driving the car safely, but being saved by grace is just describing what goes on in the transmission. It's just the background. Anyway, so that's so interesting to me to realize that this goes right back to the beginning of who we are.
I have an anecdote, and I'll try to keep it brief. But after my mother died, I got acquainted with one of her bridesmaids. It was a Japanese nurse who managed to. PUC shipped her off to Boston to take nursing in Boston when the rest of the Japanese went into camps here in California. And so I was the guest of this wonderful elderly Japanese lady in Oakland. And one evening I was describing the gift of salvation to her. And she said, "Yes, but then you must obey." And I'm thinking, we lost it.
Yeah.
Just
it's astonishing, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah.
I want to add one more thing. Your marvelous picture of the terrified man in the second coming. Do you know who anything about the artist who did
Yeah,
that?
the artist's name was Eldridge, and
Yeah, Robert
he was at the
Eldridge.
review. He was at the review in Tacoma Park when he painted that. The I can do a whole talk just on the illustrations of Adventist journals, both at the Pacific Press there in Oakland and the Review and Herald, for mainly in Tacoma Park after 1901 or so. And those illustrations are very influential, very much so.
Well, I was going to say, for those of you who, this is something that some of you might remember. I'm sharing it. This
Oh, yeah.
is Robert Eldridge, and those of you who went to Seventh-day Adventist schools will remember that there was a textbook, and this is from this textbook called Principles of Life.
Yep.
And the entire thing was illustrated by Robert M. Eldridge. And virtually all of the illustrations were gruesome, truly gruesome. There were hardly any that were not that were wholly grace-oriented. And this is one of them. I just thought you might enjoy seeing this.
Yeah.
This is one of those from Principles of Life, which is fascinating to look through now. And I wonder every time I look at it, how I managed to survive Seventh-day Adventism as a semi-normal human being.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for
Although
that.
some people might doubt that.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Dr. Johnson, you're next, please.
My question is about the tension between Adventism and the contemporary culture. In the early days, was there a tension, or was it really a reflection of the larger culture? We have to remember that a sermon with the title Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God produced a revival back in those days. So was there a countercultural aspect to what you're finding, or was it actually a very diminished tension with the contemporary culture? And along with that, it seems a little strange that the less legalistic we became, the less growth we had, according to your numbers.
Consult your friend Brian, your sociologist on campus, Dwayne McBride. He sees that correlation too. That cultures that are he was seeing the correlation with cultures that are lower on the Gini index are more legalistic, and Adventism has become less legalistic on the average as we experience economic prosperity. Yeah, you're asking a good question, and I got to think about it for a bit. By the way, Dr. Johnston is now a great-great-grandfather, and he should be proud of that. I think he just. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
You're processing that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have a good. I'd have to think about that. And by the culture, you're talking about the secular culture outside of Adventism.
Yeah, and the non-Adventist religious culture.
Yeah, and again, a lot of this reflects the New England religious culture, and the Presbyterians and such. But that's, find a graduate student to work on that.
I don't know if Brian Strayer has any remarks about that he'd like to share, but
Guess not.
it's such an obvious thing coming out of your numbers
Mhm.
that it seems to me we need to pay attention to it.
Well, the slowing of growth in the North American division is the result of a number of factors, and that's don't want to go down that road right now, but maybe sometime in the future.
All right, thank you. Dr. Alexander, please, your question or comment.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael. Good to see you again after some time.
Yes.
And my question is, we read texts in the Bible that say things like, we are saved by grace and not by works, lest any man should boast. And we also read, without faith without works is dead. My question is, to what extent is this confusion or contradictory element in Adventist understanding of salvation, to what extent is that attributable to the divergent viewpoints on salvation presented in the Bible itself?
Oh, I think that's true. So Adventism from maybe the 1870s has had to wrestle with this not ambiguity, well, in a kind of ambiguity, but also a internally contradictory theological statements. And what another thing that I am seeing in the old Review and Herald is an obsession with literal readings of Scripture, and that's where you get into trouble. And I mean, I encourage everyone to get onto the GC Archive website and look at just browse through the journals in the 1860s, 1870s. That they had knocked down, drag out debates about the most minute theological issue, taking a half of a text and working it to death. That was very common for the first 100 years of Adventism. It was later that they started to introduce the Greek or the Aramaic meanings of the words, going back to the more original text, because my impression of the Millerite movement was based on the King James Version. I could be wrong about that.
All right, thank you. Linda, please.
Thank you. Hi, Michael. My old college classmate.
Yes.
Albeit much younger.
We all suffered at La Sierra.
Oh, you don't know suffering. You should have gone to Keene.
Okay.
But in any case, there's an old saying that, and I'm paraphrasing as best I can remember, that you might be able to scare people into church, but you can't scare them into heaven. And I think that's something that we still, in our denomination, do not grasp. And there's a good reason for it. Because while there is lip service here and there to salvation by grace, the drumbeat is righteousness by works. And I'm really sorry, because I looked at the participants that Mr. Goldstein is not here today to hear this, because once again, in this week's Sabbath school lesson, 2 sentences, just listen to them. It doesn't take long. It's talking about worshiping God, and it says to do that, they must keep God's law, which is an expression of his holiness. Now, if one could possibly interpolate that to mean God's law of love, but that's not the context here. Okay. I'm not taking it out of context. And the other is talking about God's vengeance. And it says the practical implications of the sanctuary being the place of divine judgment are seen in the constant awareness of God's holiness and demands for righteous living according to God's covenantal requirements. That is an absolute mistruth. That's disinformation, which is different than misinformation.
Yeah.
Misinformation means I meant to say that and it's wrong, because we are not under the Sinai covenant. Our covenant is the covenant of grace. But you can see how misleading this is
You're lucky you don't work for the church.
to the average parishioner. You know, the people in the Sabbath school class I teach who
Yeah.
read this, and whether it pops into their consciousness or not, this is the drumbeat. It's exactly the same kinds of things that you saw in those obituaries. The fear that there's one thing.
Yeah.
And so we give lip service to righteousness by faith, but the truth is, in verity, I would say we really don't believe it.
Yeah. I found recently 162 letters that my father sent to my mother from World War II, from the European theater. And in one of those letters, it's tedious reading through them, but in one of those letters, he referred to a youth instructor article about salvation. Now, the GC, and I approve what the GC did in sending journals to all the troops during their isolation in World War II. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I can talk at length about the good that the GC has done for the troops. But he commented on the importance of good behavior for salvation. So I went back and I looked at that article, and it was awful. It was in October, I think, 43. I could be wrong. I don't have it in front of me, but it was a long article, and it basically said that salvation really depends on your good behavior, and one unconfessed sin, and it's all over. You're lost, and that was going out to the troops during World War II.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that we find too, although this again was tangential to what you were speaking about today, but is from what I understand, the further one goes into the Southern Hemisphere, the more strident
Oh yeah,
the legalism becomes.
I have no metrics for that, but a lot of people make that observation. Yeah.
Well, in any case, good to see you, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And thank you, Linda, for keeping us aware of how this hasn't changed a whole lot or hardly with the current publications of Sabbath School and others. We have more time for questions, by the way, and I am going to go to my friend Ed Reif-Snyder. If you would unmute Ed and make your comment, ask your question, and others, please raise your hand if you have questions.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. I read a little bit about your biography, and it says your thing is the presentation of data, and it shows. You've kind of given us a look into the past, and this is really an unfair question. So I apologize in advance, and you may not even want to answer. But you've taken us back nearly 180 years. So assuming Jesus doesn't come in the next 180 years, let's say we're midpoint in a 360-year time span, what would you predict for the Adventist Church? We've talked about some anomalies coming from our past. We've talked about some misconceptions coming from our past. We've talked about drastically changing views on salvation and behavior and all those things coming through the past. What are your thoughts about the future? So I know it's pretty tough to get out past about 30 seconds with predictions, but I'd just be interested in your general thoughts on that. Where are we going as a fellowship?
Well, first of all, Adventism is far more diverse in culture and in theology than the folk at Silver Spring are inclined to admit.
I agree.
And that diversion is usually not a problem until the people from those diverse theological communities have to work together, like in a constituency meeting or an academy board meeting or something like that. So these different theological cultures are coexisting in separate congregations. At least that's what I see around California. People have asked me, will the Adventist Church survive? Absolutely. I don't have any question about that. But it's going to be uncomfortable for progressives when the GC is still in a mindset from 100 years ago. Now, that's about as far as I'm going to go out on a limb ad hoc right now. You're muted, Ed. You need to unmute, Ed. Thank you.
Just a brief follow-up. You've mentioned that progressives will be uncomfortable if the GC holds on to its position. Would an alternative be that the GC becomes irrelevant?
In the future or now?
Yeah, both.
It may already be to a degree.
It's influential, but I don't want to go down that road right now. But
okay.
It's
I will.
Yeah,
I will go down that road. The further out of step the GC is with some parts of the world, the less relevant it will be.
Well, that's a safe observation. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Dr. Johnson, you get another round here with a question.
Oh, he remuted.
You have to unmute again.
Okay. I'd like to suggest that I'm trying to carry the conversation on a little farther and see if we can get somewhere with it. I'd like to suggest that what you call a contradiction is inherent in Arminianism, unavoidable, and perhaps desirable. The issue is also, are we saved as a result of divine sovereignty or of human freedom and agency? In Arminianism, you say all of the above. If you were a consistent Augustinian or Calvinist, you could be consistent and say salvation is 100% and solely a divine work, and it lies in God's sovereign hands. And what we do and what we believe is more a result than a cause. I think it's expressed well in a line from the hymn "Amazing Grace," and I'm not sure, but I think the author of that hymn was a Methodist. But the line is, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fear relieved." There's a process, and that process cannot skip the step of repentance, which leads to what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. I think what you are legitimately objecting to is perfectionism, but early Methodism was perfectionistic. So in trying to work this out, you need to get a complete picture, and it is not solely a theological or philosophical issue, it's also a psychological one, and what actually works in human experience. There's a certain protocol, a certain process that you cannot short circuit. That's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Gina, please, you're next.
Hi, I just have one question, and that was when you were reading some of the obituaries, I noticed that there was, at least on a couple of them, comments about how, a judgment that they will be in heaven or that they will be in the first resurrection. And I wondered how prevalent that was in the obituaries back in the early church, and just how much that affects the destiny of where we're at as a church about judging who's in and who's out, and if that's kind of a recurring theme. It's something that would require data collection, I think, and that's what you do. So
Yeah,
kind of
that's work.
Mhm.
That's work. I had lunch yesterday with one of the associate deans here on campus, and she posed a question kind of related to what you're asking. Have you considered what the obituaries don't say? And with my interest in information technology and even communication technology, the absence of something, the absence of a signal, is in fact a kind of information. And so the absence of an obituary where there should be an obituary is a concern to me. I know I looked for an obituary of Walter Ray, and I didn't find an obituary, but I sure found a good write-up on findagrave.com. So when I find grave markers for workers that were recognized in their community, but no obituary occurred in the Adventist Journal, is that an oversight, or is that a reflection of a loss of esteem or apostasy or something like that? That's a whole other study that would be interesting. But and again, I'm just wondering if 5 years from now we'll have software that can read all this stuff, and we have to teach it what to look for and the patterns and stuff, that we could come out with some metrics, not only how it was then, but how it changes over time. I'm not sure I answered your question. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I don't know that it's answerable. And I think that the question is, was there a culture where the people who held the power had the ability to say yes or no, you're in or you're out of heaven? And is that reflected in obituaries? And was your behavior to be judged by the people in power? And yes, you're good enough or not good enough to be in the church. And how does that affect the church as it stands today, where we decide certain kinds of people can't be church members? Or I'm not sure that's biblical, but I'm just putting it out there.
I think that, and I hope I pointed out clearly that the account of how good they were, and even the explicit mention that we will see them in the first resurrection, is a reflection of how anxious they were about that issue. I thank you. Yeah, I see you nodding your head. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Art, you're next.
All right. Thank you. A lot of things I'm going to say now are not ones that people haven't heard me say before, but I often heard, and I think many of you have heard sermons where you're told that how you achieve joy is Jesus first, others second, yourself last.
Yeah.
But we're kidding ourselves when we talk about that, because no one thinks like that. The Adventism I was raised in, and the Adventism I see from the outside, is obsessed with one thing, and Christianity typically is obsessed with that, is yourself. All people, that what is talked about is one's own salvation. Whose salvation? Your neighbors? The people in other parts of the world? That's relevant only if you're saved yourself. It's yourself that is the focus. So we have this tension where we say, well, you think of yourself last. No, you don't. You think of yourself first, because that's the consuming thing, the all-consuming thing. And it was the all-consuming thing when I was a child is, will I be lost? Or will I be saved?
And that's natural.
Yeah, it is. But we kid ourselves when we use these acronyms like joy and that sort of thing. It was mentioned that it was talked about how in the Southern Hemisphere, Adventism is experiencing some, that's where the growth is. Well, they're the ones who have who the fear appeals to the most. And my suggestion is that that's the true heart of Adventism. That's the reason why the growth is there. It's not happening here. It's happening there. And we kid ourselves if we think that the progressives, we talk about the progressives are, well, frankly, don't really belong, in my view. They don't fit. They don't fit. The Adventism that you introduced us to, or reintroduced us to this morning here, but today, is the heart and soul of Adventism. I've used before in the chat, but I don't think here. I'm reminded when we discuss about the views of the early church, and I think we're stuck in it because of Ellen White. It's hard to move beyond it. But we've all seen amber, that ancient pitch, basically is what it is. I think that's hardened into an amber color. That's why we call it amber. And you see those little insects that are trapped in it. That's how I view the church. And that Ellen White and the Spirit of Prophecy is that amber. And we can move, well, we just can't move out of it. And because of that, Adventism will continue to appeal to those who want to experience and continue to experience the fear. But I don't think the progressives have a home there.
I'm glad you said that. I bet you don't work for the church either.
No, I don't. You don't even belong to the church. Haven't for a decade. Yeah.
No, that I wish we had a metric, a reliable and easy to compute metric of anxiety. And I wish we could make distinctions geographically and over time of the level of anxiety. You saw one of my little charts there that plotted anxiety. That was strictly intuitive.
Yeah.
But and if you do it geographically, I would bet there's much more anxiety in some parts of the world than there are in progressive communities. I could be wrong, but I think that and let's face it, we're human. We don't want anxiety. We don't want. We want to feel good. Last Sabbath I did this same presentation to a Sabbath school class I would describe as seeking feel good. And I finally, late in life, I recognize when you don't want to upset people. I temper what I say depending on the audience. And if they just want to feel good, I'm not going to say a lot of things that I said here.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Art, for your comments and questions. Always appreciate that.
Patty, you got to email me sometime. I need to talk to
Yeah,
you.
I haven't answered your last one later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question.
Michael and I go back a ways in California. His sister Barbara was a bridesmaid at my wedding, so we kind of know each other. I was when I was a Southern California girls. I went to Loma Linda Academy, where we got those textbooks with the dripping blood in the hands, and Elder Mayberry was just, rules, rules, rules. Well, then one weekend, I went to the youth conference at Pine Springs Ranch and walked in and came face to face with Bill Dopp, who was the youth director at that time. And his first comment was, "Are you saved?"
Whoa.
And my friend who was with me, we just kind of looked at each other and we didn't know how to answer that. And Bill Dopp was going around to all the academy students at this youth retreat. And that was his question, "Are you saved?" And he did make a presentation later that weekend about how many unsure responses he got. That generation, my peers, we did not grow up with the grace. That "are you saved" question just took us, knocked us off our feet. We didn't know what to do with it. And that was really my first serious introduction to grace. And fortunately, then on at last year, we had Morris Venden. And that was a blessing. And that was what taught me in college about grace. My Sabbath school class this morning, we have been studying Paul. We just finished 2 Corinthians last week. So, of course, we start Galatians this morning. And the verses that Paul said, if you listen to anything other than what we've taught you about the gospel of God, may you die, may you be killed in heaven, may you have evil things happen to you. And he repeats himself twice about that. So we had an amazing discussion this morning about, what is the good news? What is the grace? And people are still confused about it. I hate to say it, I hate to see it, but it's just what's happening, and it drives a lot of people out of the church. I know a lot of my friends have left, and that being one of the reasons that they do. And I'm just flabbergasted that we are still having this conundrum 150 years later. Is there no way to resolve that and to get the point across that we're saved by grace? We don't have to do all this crap. Is that so hard for people to accept, and why? Is there something in our Constitution, in our background, in our upbringing that makes us unable to accept that simple fact? I'm done.
Yeah. I will say, and this is anecdotal and I could totally be wrong, but 50 years ago, Academy Bible teachers were very heavy on works. And I think there is a new generation of Academy Bible teachers that are much more oriented towards the good news of grace. I haven't seen what textbooks they're using, but that's been my observation, at least in the Loma Linda community, and that's refreshing.
That's good.
Yeah, and I think the NAD or General Conference, must be the NAD Education Department, did some studies some time ago, a few years ago, of our academy students, and among other things, I think they try to determine where they were on this continuum, or this dichotomy of grace and works, and found that we were still heavy on the work side, and I think there were efforts initiated, at least, to try to move the needle. I'm not aware of how much we've succeeded and what's happening now, but at least there was an acknowledgement, a recognition that we are still stuck in that mode.
Well, that's what I tried to say with this slide, that you can be receiving two contradictory messages, good news and bad news. But if the bad news drowns out the good news, then you're that's what people are going to be left with.
Yeah, right. All right, thank you, Patty, for your observation and questions. And Lauren, you're next.
Yes, I'd have to agree that not only Bible teachers, but there's a new generation of pastors who are much more grace-oriented. However, I would say this, what I've noticed, Michael and Raj, is a sort of schizophrenia going on where the two tracks are diverging. They're going in opposite directions. If you go to Southern California, right where you are in your conference, Michael, you can choose to go to the LGBTQ Sabbath School class at La Sierra University, or you can go to the Mentone Church, where you're going to hear a very, very different sort of message, one that sounds very much like the things that were happening back then. I want to say, though, with regard to, I've been listening with interest to this question of why was there both hope and fear in the obituaries. I noticed when you were reading them, though, mostly hope. Mostly. There was in fact, I was most surprised by the guy by the one that said, well, was it her? No, it was a woman. She wasn't quite sure whether she'd kept the Sabbath well enough, strictly enough, but she was hoping God would forgive her at the last moment anyway. That one's actually surprised me more. Having done many, many, many funerals in my life, I would say that I've never heard anybody at a funeral, even conservative pastors, stand up and say, well, we're here to say goodbye to this guy. He was an absolute scoundrel. There's nothing good I can say about him. I doubt very much we're going to see him in the resurrection. Even the worst people get to be saved in their caskets. So a certain amount, I guess I would just say, when you're doing this study, Michael, do a certain amount of adjustment for the fact that they are being written about after they're dead.
Oh, yeah. Well, they weren't all scoundrels, but I think the expressions of hope are efforts to mitigate the anxiety.
Yes.
And if you go,
which is what we do at funerals, Michael.
It is what a pastor does and should do. If you go through the Atlantic Union Gleaner, and I have found well over 150 references to my grandfather. I learned so much more about him than ever came down through family oral history. And what you see at the end of an obituary is words of comfort were offered by the author. This is the role of a minister, words of comfort.
I had an uncle who very much would have deserved the description at his funeral that this man was an absolute scoundrel. He was cruel to the people around him. He was unkind. Everybody knew this. Yet at his funeral, he was preached into a good resurrection.
Are we talking about Are we talking about the same man?
Well, if you and I have the same uncle, perhaps. I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Lauren. Ed Zukwitz, you're next, please.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up this history of what the church was like. It reminded me of the old Jones and Wagner's issue of 1888 and Ellen White and so forth. And then I've noticed in the chats discussions about righteousness by faith and how relevant it is or isn't and so forth. Now in Romans 4:24, it talks about us being counted or credited with, depending on the version, with righteousness if we believe in the God who raised Jesus Christ. So this talk about fear and, did we confess our last sin and all this other stuff? I mean, it's humanly impossible the older we get to even contemplate that fact. First of all, it's unrealistic. It's an external thing. Some of these things that are being imposed, let's say, legalistically or taught legalistically by the church are external things. And if we allow that to control our spiritual growth or spiritual journey, then what does it say about our spiritual journey if we're allowing external things to control that? So getting back to this idea of, can we be righteous? Yes, by the grace of God, we can be righteous. And if our belief is that God raised Jesus, according to those texts or other texts about righteousness by faith, we are viewed as being righteous. Now, how does that actually work out in reality? I don't know, but it gives us the insurance that we don't have to be worried about all these little points and legalistic things and all that other stuff in order to feel assured in our spiritual journey and our eternal salvation, if we believe we have that. So I just want to ask you if I'm curious how prevalent that sort of historical stuff you've brought up is really taking place today in our church all around the world. I have the sense that it isn't so prevalent anymore.
You mean the anxiety?
Yeah, the anxiety. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just as bad or even worse.
Well, it's harder to measure these days because at least in the Pacific Union Recorder, there are far fewer obituaries and they're very short. And I've complained about that, but I'm not getting much traction. I think that's a reflection of the a profound change in the nature of Adventist community. So we've got to find other measures of that anxiety, or other indicators of that anxiety. First, we have to detect it, and then after a while, we might be able to measure it.
Well, it's hard. You'd think with our technology today and a vast communication and all this other stuff, it'd be easier, but I don't know.
People may not express their anxiety to strangers.
Well, even within the Adventist churches, amongst their own folk, so to speak.
Oh, we're taught to be optimistic and be confident of our faith. We don't admit doubt.
It might interest you, Michael, that several years ago, when we had Monty Celine on staff here in our Ohio conference, that we launched an annual survey of our membership. And one of the key elements that we were trying to determine was this very thing about assurance of salvation. And our interest, of course, was to move the needle here in Ohio and be selective as to who we invite to be pastors here and who we invite as speakers at camp meeting, so that we no longer keep sending contradictory messages. And it seemed like we did move the needle a little bit at least, but that did not resolve the issue completely. But we did do some research through surveys, and of course, how honest people were in responding to those surveys is another whole issue, which I don't do surveys, so I don't understand that. But we did do that, try to get that information here at least for a while.
Yep.
All right, James Wilson, please, your question.
Yes, this is more of a comment than a question. I think part of the difficulty is that Adventism is very diverse, and people in certain areas are exposed to different things. I grew up Adventist. My father was publishing secretary at the Union in Jamaica. I went to last year, to finish up my college. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I met enough people who saw Adventists as being legalistic for me to actually recognize that this was an issue within Adventism. Because all the people that I had associated, I mean, part of the problem is that we use the same words regardless of what we believe. And so it's not really clear where people are coming from just by what is being said. Because, as was pointed out earlier, the Bible approaches it from both places. And because my father was publishing secretary, I read a lot of Ellen White. And from reading Ellen White, it just never dawned on me that people should be legalistic. I mean, the way I interpreted what she said, made grace the only option. So I think it's going to be hard to pin down where people are. I guess part of the thing is I am not as concerned about Adventists being able to coexist with these different groups because it has always been that way, at least from my perception.
Yeah. Sometimes when you're in a culture, you're in a bubble and you don't realize the elements of your bubble. I guess when I spoke to an audience in Australia, I said, I don't have an accent. You all have an accent. It's all from your perspective. And by the way, we were talking earlier about the legitimacy of being concerned about yourself. And there's a message in Adventism that you should be totally selfish. I remember one minister telling us that labor unions, no, rights, civil rights is sinful. Civil rights movements are sinful because it's based on selfishness, and that's inherently sinful. Boy, that's a problem.
I guess, that's something that I find interesting because, I guess the way I grew up, I felt like, the whole point of going to heaven, the people who will go to heaven are the people who would be comfortable living with God. And from my perspective, it really, if I didn't go to heaven, it was because I wouldn't be happy there. So it wasn't something that I should be overly concerned about. Because
you're lucky.
If I'm gonna be happy, I'll go to heaven. If I'm not gonna be happy there, I won't. And there's no reason to weep and cry over not going to heaven if you're not gonna be happy there. So I mean, a lot of it is the mental image that you're given early on as to how these things should look. Because I mean, I can look at some people and I'm saying there is no way they were gonna be happy in heaven. I mean, that's not, to me, that's not good or bad. They're just not the kind of people who would enjoy being nice to other people, that wouldn't take great pleasure in stomping on other people. To me, they're just not going to go to heaven because they wouldn't be happy there. And, so a lot of it is the image that you have as to how these things work. And then the words you say may not actually convey that information to others.
Thank you. Thank you, James, for your comments. Appreciate that. Ray, you are next. Go ahead.
So many thoughts as you're going through all of this. But what Art said, yeah, that was true for much of a life. You're always concerned about yourself and your own savability or being saved. But isn't it when you get past that you begin to really enjoy life? How do you enjoy life in any capacity if that's what your concern is always about?
Mm-hmm.
it's only to me as one gets older and you can look back and say, there's mistakes, blah, blah, blah. It's like, how can you possibly think your future is dependent upon what you have done or not done? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. And then I always think of John 3:16, which when you talk about it, then people want to go on and add all the other verses, but it's just simple. And it just became if you believe, then you've been saved. So why not say it and be happy, enjoy your life? Then you can enjoy other people. Then you are more concerned about other people because you've taken away the pressure of worrying about yourself.
If you're not
Self
worried
is not
about
so important anymore.
if you're not worried about salvation, then you can take risks to attack evil.
Absolutely. And that seems to be one of the things that is currently within our GC leadership. The biggest concern is not taking any risk. We still have this circle the wagons attitude. You can read any of the periodicals put out and it's got a circle. And it's like, don't you want people to be happy?
All right, Ray, thank you. Terry, I see your hand. You're next, please.
Good morning. Well, it's good morning where I am. I'm in Australia, down south. And you guys have got the accent and I don't. Michael, we've just reversed our situation here.
Sure.
I'm sure I've got an accent, but you guys have got an accent as well. I'm very interested in what you've had to say, Michael. Very interested indeed, but I come from a bit of a different background in Australia. I was not born a Seventh-day Adventist. I didn't grow up Adventist. I was brought into the church, or if you want to use that terminology. I don't particularly like being brought into the church as a terminology. Studied into the church, maybe. A good friend was an Adventist. We don't have the history that you gentlemen and ladies do, in the fact with your connections, as far as your history search with obituary goes. I have no connections with Adventism as fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, or anything like that. So there's no background there for me. I'm just wondering, Michael, if you did some research, or even if you just can answer the question, do you think that the demographics would be different if you researched those that had the connection to Adventists as opposed to those who don't, historically, connections, your upbringing, and those sort of things?
The demographics of the church would be different if Adventism arose not in New England, or what? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I'm just looking at what you've been talking about as far as, and you look like most of you have some historical connection with your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and you can go right back. Whereas there are people who don't have that connection, like myself.
Right.
Would your study be different if you differentiated between the two groups?
Well, I wonder if your personal theology would be different if you didn't have the baggage I have.
Yeah, I've got a feeling it probably is.
Yeah.
May I also say that what happens in the North American division doesn't seem to filter down to the grassroots here in Australia. Now, that's a very broad generalisation, but a lot of what you talk about doesn't seem to come here to Australia, even though I know you.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of the issues I describe are not issues. in other countries. That wouldn't surprise me at all. So in that respect, I apologize for taking your time about talking about a North American issue. But
no, I think it's very important that you do, but I think it's much more, well, just as important that we know these things. You know, I can walk into our local church here, and it's like walking back into time. You know, it's not. You know, there is the progressive thought, but there is also that real stagnant thought. I often say to people, not being rude or anything like that. I was trying to think of another word, but Adventism is sometimes what I see as an American religion, which has been transported to Australia or other countries, but it's your religion because that's where it started. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that inherently, I don't believe.
I think the Bull and Lockhart book brought that out. That Adventism had a lot of unique American characteristics. I have started to wonder, the Dallas 27 doctrines that were voted in Dallas in 1980 employ a lot of text references. The doctrines were written in English, and the text references are generally English, or an English Bible. And I wonder what would have happened if the GC said the numeric majority of the church is Spanish speaking, and we're going to ask those Adventist scholars in the third world, particularly South America, to develop 27 doctrines for us and express them in Spanish. Yeah. What would Adventism be like if that happened? And if for a fun exercise, if you have nothing to do this evening, Google and find out how many different languages the doctrines are expressed in Chinese or Swahili, not just expressed but published. You're not going to find many. And so that again tells me that Adventism is still a North American English language phenomenon.
Right. Yeah. Very, very, very interesting, Michael. Very, very interesting indeed. Very interesting. Just on the fear side, I don't know whether I mentioned last time when I was on, because I get on a bit late sometimes, 4:30 in the morning here in Brisbane in Australia. Sometimes, although I wake up usually at that time, but back to my personal experiences being studied with, and my wife, we were studied by Adventist pastors on the basis of fear. There's no question. It was on the basis of fear. We were told if we didn't hurry up, the word was procrastinate. Don't procrastinate, Terry. I didn't know what the word procrastinate meant at that particular time. I did find out a little bit later, but don't procrastinate, because we wanted our parents and our relatives and everything else who were not Adventists and objected to our stand of being studied with to, acquiesce, to accept that, but they wouldn't. So we wanted to delay it, and I said, no, don't delay. Don't delay.
You could be hit by a truck.
Absolutely. We were just married, my wife and I. Don't have children. Jesus is coming soon. Jesus is coming soon. Don't have any kids. So it was definitely fear. But I've been exposed to some great teachers here. One who's passed away a few years ago was Dr. Desmond Ford. He was my lecturer at Avondale University. And I've known him, and my wife and I talked and walked with him a few years prior to his death. And thank God for that. And I mean that in that real sense. Thank God for that, because Dr. Desmond Ford and many other theologians in Australia, Dr. Norman Young, and there's many others I could reel off, who are gospel Jesus, grace-filled gentlemen. And I've won that. I've experienced that grace Thank you. I've taken too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate your comments, and glad you're part of this this community. Before I hand it back to Lauren here, Michael, I have a sort of an unrelated question from one of your earlier slides. You talked about the number of obituaries for children, and obviously there were a lot of children who must have died at the time. Do you see any connections between that and the interest that the church developed in wellness and healthful living?
I don't think the high mortality rate of children drove healthful living. I think there were other factors that drove, and certainly Ellen White was influential in driving that. No, I obviously the mortality rate went down, but health conditions, both public health, the elimination of disease, hygiene, and medical care improved across the whole country, if not the Western world. And I think that's a bigger factor in the reduction of mortality.
Okay, interesting. Linda, you have more comments or more questions? Go ahead, please.
Well, since there's just a bit of time, I'll share something that Michael might be interested in. It's been almost 25 years ago since John F. Kennedy Jr. Died in the plane crash, and I'm sure most everybody here remembers that. And I made a note of it at the time, not of that specific event, but of comments in the wake of it. And I guess maybe this will illustrate we're not the only ones with uncertainty and angst. But Billy Graham, who was still living at that point in time, obviously was interviewed by a newscaster. And he was asked by the newscaster, what do you say to the families, of these young people that have died in such a tragic way? And he said, well, it's all part of God's plan, which of course, made me wince. But then the newscaster went on and says, well, is John F. Kennedy Jr. in heaven now with his mother, who had predeceased him? And Billy Graham said, and this is sort of the punchline, he says, maybe, but I can't say for sure.
My experience with these kind of discussions is it really gets rich in the last 5 minutes before you have to quit. and you are on the edge. I mean, you've stumbled over into the topic I call divine temporal activism. How active is God in manipulating the temporal or material things of this world? And that's a good hour and a half. And thank you for ruining my afternoon.
You're entirely welcome. It was my esteemed pleasure.
Thank you, Linda.
But in truth, I think that, almost every, I would say the majority, because I'm like Raj, I don't know everybody here and can't see everybody's faces, but I think there are a significant number of us who have white hair like me. And I think the big question for us is that how do we help our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren? How do we help them to break out of this mold if we still have relevance and influence over them spiritually? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't help but notice, Michael, as you were going through this, there was several times where there was a little arrow that came and it said 1 hour presentation or 2 hour.
No, that's a 1 hour topic. That's my way of saying I'm only touching on the topic. So there's a lot more to discuss.
What I took away from that is that you have a lot more to bring to us in the future. So let me thank you for today. And I will turn it over to Lauren. This is very fascinating, very informative, and I thank you for your time and your effort. So Lauren, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this has been great. I want to thank Terry Docking for something that I have never heard before. I have never heard anybody say that they were told when they joined the church that they shouldn't have children because Jesus was coming soon. Have you heard that, Raj? I certainly never have.
I've heard about it anecdotally, but it was never said to me.
It was certainly not said to us, and I can honestly affirm that I have never said that. I have never counseled anybody in that way in my entire ministry. And so that's interesting because something you may remember, Michael, from Seeking a Sanctuary. Now, I've told this story before, and I hate to tell stories over and over again, but some of them hit you so hard that they become kind of part of your own mythology. And one was, Linda made me think of this, the assassination of President Kennedy. I remember when he was elected, and people in church were weeping.
Mm-hmm.
They said, mm-hmm. This is the end.
Yep.
This is it. It's going to be, that Sabbath, there were people weeping in church, in my little country church.
A Catholic was made president.
And that people stood to their feet and said, this is evidence. The Pope has found his way into the White House. Mm-hmm. We are now under the influence. The Sunday laws will be happening soon. We will be under the threat of the persecution, the death decree, and people were weeping. And honest to God, I will tell you, Michael, when he was assassinated a few years later, people stood up in church and said, "Praise the Lord." The Lord has saw, as I recall, the words was, "The Lord has saw fit to hold back the winds of strife." Mm. A young man is killed, and they're saying, "Praise the Lord."
There's one of many contradictory feelings in Adventism. We want to hasten the second return, but not too soon. I got stuff I want to do, and Adventism has fostered this perpetual anxiety. I had a friend who every untoward incident, September 11, oh, it can't be long now. Someone's probably saying that about the Gaza war. It can't be long now. We've been doing this for 175 or more years. You can't sustain that sense of urgency and still stay credible.
No, the word soon becomes meaningless. In fact, Michael, in Seeking a Sanctuary, they make note of the fact that when Kennedy was elected, there was a great deal of doomsaying before he was elected. When he was elected, mm-hmm. the Review and Herald published a piece saying, we are not to take a stand against this president. We look forward to him continuing to enforce freedom of religion. Isn't it interesting that we're far closer to losing some of those freedoms under the Christian nationalism sort of thing that reigns now? Protestants rather than Catholics. Isn't that interesting?
There is so much interesting grain and detail in these historic journals. During World War II, there was, on the cover of the review, there was an open letter to FDR. I don't think many people remember that. In fact, there were
don't remember that.
Well, you're too young. There were 4 presidents that their photos were on the cover of the Review and Herald back before 1930. So there's all kinds of stuff in there. There's just so much of it. It's hard to grasp.
Have you ever looked at the 100-year anniversary issue of the Review and Herald? Somebody sent me a copy of it a couple of years ago. I was fascinated by it because I was expecting a great deal more woe and sadness and breaks being on the brink than actually was there. It was actually fairly mild in
Well,
how
they may have cherry picked. I may be guilty of cherry picking obituaries, but they may have cherry picked some of the stuff. I mean, when you have 100 years and that, what is that, 5,000 issues? Wow, that's a lot of material.
Well, as I recall, I don't have it in front of me now. I've got it to, I didn't think I'd need it. But as I recall, they were new pieces, but they weren't pieces saying that were terribly frightening. I thought they would be. I thought it would be all, oh, things are terrible. They're so much worse than they were now. It was fairly mild. It was fairly soft.
Yeah.
Take a look at it sometime. I'll share it with you.
Okay, thank
we
you.
have one more person. That is John Reiswig, who is here. And John, I don't want to leave you out. Go ahead and
just a
Reiswig
note,
Reiswig by the name is a very good North Dakota name that I'm very familiar with.
yeah, it is from North Dakota, but now at the moment from California, but normally Alaska. Anyway, I just meant to mention that Graham Maxwell many times mentioned in his talk that his parents were told not to have children. So Uncle Arthur was told not to have children because the Lord was coming. And he jokes about that in relationship to the illustration.
Somehow John got muted there. I apologize, John. I'm gonna go ahead and bring this to a halt. Let me check to see if Jim didn't give me a title, so he must be in church at Loma Linda right now. I don't know, or finishing his class, wouldn't he be, Michael?
Yeah, that class can draw on quite into the afternoon.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what happened. And sometimes after their class there, they have lunch too. I've been there when they've done that.
Yeah.
So he may not even be looking. I'm going to say goodbye to all of you. John, I apologize for you getting cut off here at the end. And next week, I will let you all know. Keep in mind that we announce the class 3 ways. On Wednesday, we have an announcement on the website. On Friday, we send out our email blast where we announce it. Then on Saturday morning, again, we have under the editorial that we publish every Saturday morning, we always have the links for the class. And plus, I have a few of you that I know personally who I send reminders to. And Michael, to all of your friends, make sure they're welcome to join us anytime. Let them know if you see something that interests you. Goodbye, everybody.